So this is the Cosmos Café on June 18th. We don't have a title yet, but we're discussing, which came from Ed simply asking John in the forum, what book are you reading? When John mentioned he was relaxing and reading a book, and he briefly stated, well, I'm reading Richard Kearney's Anatheism.
Yeah, this one.
Okay. Right. And so I think we're all interested in the topic. John posted the Entitled Opinions session that was done with Richard Kearney and the host of Entitled Opinions. I'm forgetting his name right now, but good interview. And I think it gave a good summary of the book, which I suppose I can kind of lay out the basic outline of what Anatheism is. So essentially, Kearney is coming from this, not from a theological stance, but his background is in philosophy and hermeneutics. And he's talking about the God after God. So his idea of Anatheism, he's coining the term, I suppose, but he's not necessarily taking claim as the original thinker of this idea of returning to God after God has died, so to speak. So even before World War II and the trauma that was experienced then, there's always been this kind of coming into religion, coming into God, questioning the theological terms of what it means to believe in God, what it means to follow a particular faith. So there's the going into, the coming out, and then the anatheism is the return to this God, whatever that God may be. I found this topic very interesting for me personally. I know Kearney goes into his own focal points in the book, which he focuses on kind of some of he's into a lot of the French philosophers, Levinas, Derrida, just to name a couple. But he focuses on some of their ideas. I'm sorry, I can't do that justice right now. I'm trying to picture the entire book in my head right now. But this topic was one of the reasons I came to this site. And well, this is Andrew's first time here, so we're glad to have Andrew Field here, which he's also kind of exploring. He said he's here because he's excited to have an intelligent conversation. We wouldn't consider ourselves the most intelligent people on earth, but we do like to think, we do like to read, and that's one of the core elements of this return, is the questioning, the processing, the observing the potentially infinite points of view out there. And maybe Ed or someone else can explain the term that I'm mispronouncing, hermeneutics. But essentially, we each have our own interpretation of said thing. In this case, of the divine, of God, of religion, or spiritual orientation, however you want to phrase it. And yeah, so each of us here have our own perspectives, and perhaps we can do a little introduction into how we arrived into this returning to God. I'd say each of us here have had some experience with that, not necessarily within the Christian tradition, though we are quite waspy here. And I'll just briefly give my jump into this, which I did go to church when I was younger. I did attend a Christian faith, but I never believed in that God that I can remember when I began thinking for myself. But 2 years ago, I began questioning again, how can I reintroduce myself into this faith that others hold on to? That's something Kearney notes, is that although the academic realm and maybe those in the scientific quarter really jump into atheism or jump into this stance as, well, we already know that this is kind of a mythological view, or, well, we don't hold on to that because we have to hold on to our science. And to believe in some sort of mythical or monotheistic God is to hinder our progress in these developments or in our thinking. But for me personally, Paul Tillich was the one that introduced me to this concept of returning to God. He took kind of the philosophical questions that we all have and provided a theological answer, though some of his answers didn't really answer a lot of my questions, but his dialectic stance really helped out. But Kearney isn't necessarily going into dialectics here, though it does seem to be like atheism, theism, and kind of something in between that he's searching for. There's so many more dynamics that he goes into. One of the main ones is the sense of receiving the other or receiving the stranger. And perhaps we can go more into that later, but it seemed like there's one other thing I wanted to say. I'll leave it at that for now. I'll open it up to personal experience. And as always, we allow the conversation to have some sort of frame, but at the same time, we proceed in whatever direction we see fit. So maybe I'll start with John, if you have anything to say.
Well, yeah, I have a lot to say, but it's not very organized. I sort of, I'm reading this book, Anatheism. Kearney's also written another book, this one, The Anatheistic Wager. It's a compilation of interviews with different theologians and philosophers. And that caught my attention because I'm preparing with Ed and TJ to do a study of this book, The Axial Age and Its Consequences. It's edited by Hans Joas and Robert Bella. And we want to present this to the community. And if there's any interest, I hope that people will join us into developing that. So also some of us have read Kripal, Jeffrey Kripal's book, The Flip. I think I have it around here somewhere. And what I find so compelling about Jeffrey Kripal is a philosopher of religion at Rice University. He talks about the pre-modern, the modern, and the postmodern, and how he moves back and forth between these categories. And he is expressing a desire to move towards a gnostic postmodernity. And I find that very, very compelling. And also very confusing. I'll just give you an example of some of my, an episode that happened to me. I guess this was about 35 years ago. And I was in the midst of a tremendous personal crisis. And I had been visited at night by an energy that I labeled demonic. It scared the hell out of me. And it wouldn't seem to go away. It would come frequently at night, and I would have these battles, very much like the biblical battle between Jacob and the angel, where there's this wrestling match. I think that I was not prepared to deal with this incredible force, which I was extremely threatened by. And I called out. I used the old monk's prayer that I knew by heart. Now by the power of the Christ of God within me, whom I worship with all my heart and all my soul and all my strength, I encompass myself within the divine circle of his protection over which no mortal error dare to pass. Do you surrender to the Christ of God within me? And this force said, that doesn't work if you don't believe in it. And then that opened me up to a vast dilemma. And at that point, I found trying to maintain this boundary against this force was too exhausting. And I let go. And then the boundary dissolved into ecstatic union. And when I'm talking about ecstatic, I'm talking nothing in the physical can possibly match this intensity. And then I returned to the ordinary. You know, I woke up, I was in my bed in Manhattan. The sort of normal experience of a physical body, but everything had changed. And I'm not saying it changed for the better. And I'm sort of wanting to add something to this personal, first-person lived experience. And something that I read in one of Jeffrey Kripal's books. And then I'm eager to listen to you guys, whatever is coming up for you. He's reporting this incident. One of his students from South Korea wrote about this experience, which he had while he was in a classroom. I think he was a teenager. And he says, suddenly, something weird happened to my body. He was looking outside the window, actually. He was looking at the light on the leaves outside the window of this classroom. He says, something weird happened to my body. I felt like thousands of hot, small worms came into the existence inside of me. At first, they appeared near my foot and crawled up my body, making my pleasure bigger and bigger, as if the dead body of an animal was full of tens of thousands of small maggots without leaving any space. My body was being fully occupied by all these hot and small creeping things. They made me feel that my body was boiling like hot water. In that way, my body was getting hotter and more aroused by the upward creeping of the innumerable energy worms, and my whole body and mind were filled with even greater pleasure. And when those creeping and crawling things inside reached my whole body, it happened. Or more exactly, I exploded into it. I am not created and cannot die or expire. I completely know that I am absolute. Thus, I have no need at all, and in that sense, I am totally satisfying. I am everything, and at the same time, very paradoxically, nothing. I am no thing at all. I am just I am. At the same time, I am a living energy in great bliss. I am so full of living energy, but paradoxically, I am also empty. I am moving, but not moved as a whole. So I think these are two roughly contemporaneous experiences. One is a self-report, and one is a quote from Kripal's book. And this description, this person who made this description, he has actually written a book on Plotinus. So he's working with that Neoplatonic area of scholarship. But I think it came out of his own direct experience and his curiosity about what this means or where this comes from. So I think these are the kind of dilemmas we are sort of trying to negotiate as we look at the modern, the pre-modern, postmodern expressions of these, what I think Kripal is calling the return of the Gnostic. And I believe there's a deep relationship between this and Walt Whitman's I Am the Body Electric. And I know Andrew has some insights into that particular poet, whom I dearly love and cherish. He's very close to my heart. So I'm just throwing this out there with curiosity about what you guys are how you're making sense of all of this, and what meanings you can make of all of this. And I also think the confusion, and I think this is what Richard Kearney is trying to address, is the atheist and the believer, and what happens when the believer becomes an atheist, and then what happens? Because I'm reminded of Simone Weil, who was who died, I think, in solidarity with those who were in the who were being exterminated in the and I think with the Jews who were being exterminated during the Nazi era. She starved herself to death in solidarity with those persons. And she said something very significant, I think. She says, and she was Jewish. She was raised in a Jewish family, but she got very engrossed in Christian theology. And she had many ecstatic episodes. She says about the atheist, she says, you may know God through his presence. And you can certainly know God through his absence. So she had a great empathy for the atheists. And I think that she recognized atheism as a sincere spiritual orientation. She goes on to say that for the Christian, you have to cut down the tree, pull up the tree from the roots, fashion it into a cross, and carry it on your back every day. That's quite a tall order. So I'm gonna, there's a lot more I'd like to say, but I'm gonna press the pause button before I get too carried away here. And I'm curious about everyone's responses and what support you might need in your own process, because this is hardly easy to figure out. Thank you.
Any of you guys want to go? John's always the tough act to follow. It's one thing when Doug gives this intro that opens up these double sliding doors. Okay. and then John goes, well, I just want to say one thing, okay? Or I know I'm going to focus on this, and all of a sudden you're out over the yard, out into the fields. The forest is in front of you. There's mountains coming up over here. I don't know whether we're riding in a car or whether we're walking, whatever, because this keeps opening up. And one of the things that I find sometimes challenging about our discussions is that they are so open that it's hard to make sure that we stay on track with something. Not that there has to be one track, but there could be many tracks. To come back to one thing that Doug said, I'm guessing in English that the word is hermeneutics for the same reason that you say therapeutic, because of how the EU is sounded. In German, you would say hermeneutic, because that's how the EU is sounded. It's an oi. I consider the good fortune to have studied with a professor at Gießen when I was studying over here. He was my supervisor, who had studied with Gadamer and Heidegger. He was an Anglist, but he had like a minor in philosophy. That was his side side interest, and he was writing a book on the comprehension of texts when I encountered him. So it was all about understanding things and fundamentally, how do we interpret and why do we interpret the ways that we do? And what I really appreciate about Kearney is that's his main issue, is how do we understand what it is that we're doing and what we're saying and what other people are saying. And I find him a fascinating individual because he's Irish, so he comes out of that Anglo-Saxon analytic philosophical side. But he studied he studied in a Benedictine abbey. He got his degree from the University of Dublin. He studied with Charles Taylor at McGill University, and then he got his PhD at the Sorbonne, Nanterre, which is out in Versailles, which is just southeast of Paris, which if you ever do get a chance to get to Europe and take a look at Gothic cathedrals, Notre Dame, Paris burned, don't miss going to Chartres and Versailles. You just have to go there because those are ones that you have to see. So this whole idea of how do we even understand anything at all has been always been dear to my heart. And what I really like is that as of late, there are a lot of sane voices. It will sound too harsh when I say there were a lot of insane voices. That's how I consider most of what postmodernism was. Telling us that it's okay to understand things again, and that actually it's very helpful to do that. So whenever we have an opportunity, whether it's amongst ourselves or with the help of individuals like Kearney in this book, that we can think about how do we understand and what are we understanding and why do we think we understand what we understand, I always find that exceedingly attractive. And so that's kind of, what I bring to the picture. I was forced to go to Sunday school and church most of my youth because my mother had been born again and believed that we all needed to be there. So I went. I was an obedient child like everyone else, but I'm also not exactly the person that you want to have forced into a situation, because I kept asking questions of my Sunday school teachers that they couldn't answer, and they felt that they needed to talk to my mother about what was going on at home because he's asking things that he shouldn't be asking. Because I've always had a problem with the exclusivity of Christianity. That's probably the fundamental issue. I don't really care what you believe if you have good reasons to believe it. And if you're not hurting other people, I'm really not bothered by it at all. But the moment that you feel that whatever it is that you believe is what everyone else on the entire planet should believe, I start getting a little antsy. And I'm going, I think we need to think about this again. And I have found that if you can allow people to tell you why they believe what they believe, you realize very quickly that you're a lot closer to them than whatever statements they may be making about their beliefs would lead you to believe. Because at bottom, and John brought this up in a couple of ways in what he was saying, how do we manage this? How do we deal with this? How do we get through this? How do we interact with it in such a way that we can make sense of whatever it is that's moving us? I'll put it that way. I always like when John talks about these demonic entities that he encounters, because I can't recall the last time that any one of them was actually demonic. They always kind of had a little twist at the end. It's just like, so I'm going to say the prayer because this is the way I can protect myself. And then you get this, well, that's all well and good, but formalisms don't count here. There has to be more of you in it than lip movements. And that more of you in it is the part that I find most interesting and most rewarding to explore. because there obviously is some kind of substance in all of this, regardless of how we're talking about it. And what I really appreciated in the interview with Kearney is that he kept pointing that out. He's able, even though he does come from a Christian background himself, he's able to bring in from many other religious traditions why what they're saying is not so different than what we're saying. And I can truly understand why he's got these projects going about, because that was, for me, if there was one little part of that entire interview, it was the recognition, because no one had made it aware to me before, of the closeness of the words hospitable and hostility, that bringing together the host kind of thing. You know, Gapser talks about Urworte, you know, the ones that mean they're same and they mean the opposite. And host seems to be one of those, which Gapser doesn't mention, and it's a good one to know about, because that is truly, the thing that attracts me to the entire Abrahamic tradition is the hospitality aspect. You know, the story with Abraham and the three strangers that show up, you welcome them because that's what you do, even though they could be threatening, but you diffuse the threateningness by opening yourself to them. And I see that same kind of principle involved in the story, in a lot of the stories that John tells us about experiences that he has. Because you can try, you can say the monk's prayer, but you're not really impressing the other in that moment, because the other is a little smarter in that regard, and in that instance, and kind of knows how things work, and they're gracious enough not to strike you with a bolt of lightning or zap you into the next dimension or whatever. They just go, nice try, but it doesn't work here. Try, and basically the unspoken is, so try again. And then you try again, and you get this other reaction to what's going on. And this is what I hear Kearney talking about in the interview. I haven't read the book. My interest has been exceedingly piqued, I have to admit, so I probably will. I've got it on my anticipated acquisitions list. I'll probably pick it up and read it soon. Of course, I have a lot of other things, as John pointed out. We're trying to get through the actual ages and its consequences. It's no easy matter. I decided, well, I have to get a little Gapser refresher going here for a couple of issues that are coming up. That's not happening. And the encounter with Bella said, well, maybe you ought to take a closer look at the evolution of religion. So, which is also no small tome. So all of a sudden, I find myself almost overwhelmed with the amount that I would like or feel that I need to be reading at the moment. So, Kearney's book becomes one of those fillers, for the odd moment when I'm not really trying to figure something out, because a lot of what he said spoke to things that are not intellectual. There's a whole lot of what's going on there that is at a degree of intensity that it is not, that's not just mind-based, brain-based, intellectual, thought-based, cognitive. However it is that we're describing that, we need to sort some of those terms out, and that I find exceedingly attractive about what he's saying. This is taking place at a point in our being that's not head-based. And that I appreciate very much, because he and a lot of what he said, especially when he started talking about the neglected senses of taste and touch and whatnot, I have a problem understanding what most people say when they talk about embodiedness. And he opened up a door there that said, okay, all right, I think I know what corridor I can start running down, looking for things and whatnot that isn't as off-putting as a lot of things that we run into otherwise. One of the things I think we have a problem with if we're in postmodernity, wherever we are today, is that people say stuff but they don't really explain or delineate or clarify why they chose to phrase it that way as opposed to another way. And so you're kind of stuck with the statement that I have to figure out instead of, and what Kearney did is he offers a couple of helps of how you might deal with that, at least as a starter, to figure out how to go further with it afterwards, which is, I find exceedingly helpful, but I wouldn't expect anything less of a person whose main course of development, let's call it a scholarship, the main course of scholarship is hermeneutics, which, if I were to give a succinct definition of the term, it's the art and science of interpretation. So taking that as a basis, then you know, well, we're dealing with interpretations, but at least he's telling you how I got here, why, how this relates, and you can bring that in with your own. So that's kind of my riff off of what Doug's intro and John's follow-up there that started throwing doors open here at an exceedingly rapid rate.
Wow. Okay, so I'm standing in a river. It's not a forest, it's a freaking river. And all of this flow, and there's two, it's framed by two sides. And I'm trying to lift up a bridge of my own weight like Hercules to bridge the two sides, because I haven't figured out how to do it from either side. I'm just fucking stuck in the middle. And it goes to the point of Richard, is it Kearney?
Well, he's Irish and he calls himself Kearney. So
Kearney, that's what. Yeah, and I appreciate these Irish. Thank you, Ed. Thank you.
He opened his mouth. I didn't know anything about him. He opens his mouth, and I'm going. So, where from the island is from the island is this guy?
Yeah.
Turned out he was born in Cork. So,
yeah,
which is
yeah.
It's Kearney. On the other end of the island where my ancestors came from. So.
Okay, so Kearney, and I dove into the Kindle sample, at least, of the book Anatheism, and I just have been all over the place. And this morning I spent time with a book that he wrote, called Carnal Hermeneutics. And one of the roads he's going down that I appreciate, and everybody will know why, you know me, I appreciate it, is that touch and taste, the body is a medium to figure shit out, to live in this life. And part of that, I like how he brought in the Christian notion of hospitality and guest, and then this whole input of other, and how to be with other and work with others, and how, quote unquote, that can be tense, because the biggest other that we have is life itself. And out of that, we've made images, rightfully so, to try to make sense of this big other, and we've called it God, and we broke it down into certain historical metaphors that in some ways or another that we've decided should stay and never rethink it. Even to the point of how science came along to rethink it. And science has gone down the road of being attached to their metaphors and their mental rational. But I like the fact that he is bringing in, not to just ground everything in the body, but to bring it back around, to show how it's needed, that after we've gone through all this sight and hearing and trying to figure things out with that senses, to come full circle and, okay, we need to include some of these other senses. I feel what he's doing is to help us enlarge and feel free in this life after we've dropped all our fucking sugar-coated images of God and the Father. Now, this is really interesting for me, because this reading, and I engaged this test on Father's Day. and there was, I just swam in it. I just, the good and the bad, the good and the bad. And I agree with you, Ed, and Johnny, I like the way you described it, because I've had similar experience that I've run into. Let me preface, there is bad demonic energies, but sometimes you don't know that at the time, if they're bad or not. It's like Johnny pointing out that tense moment of not trusting somebody you should have trusted and trusting somebody you shouldn't have trusted. You know, that moment, I think what he was really articulating with the image of Abraham is a way, I don't think the way he told it, it wasn't about denying the feeling of being threatened by strangers. It's about, okay, ethically, what do we do in this case? So a lot of this really boils down to me of engaging ethics in the sense, not in a very broad sense of engagement in action, not necessarily action that's pre-described, but a sense that we can be related to the action and we can develop, you know, just like when we use our hands, when we're in that action of expanding and honoring the fact that there may be a sense of threatedness. I think we need to work with that energy or work with that moment of threat, that of feeling difference in a way that we just hone. For me, it's honing, I was wrong that time. Oh, so it's giving attention to that moment, that gap of what do I do? How do I respond? The more we swim in that gap, as far as I'm concerned, the more we are willing to gently swim in that gap and work with it. I think that's the aftering he talks about. You get to the aftering. You know, you've let go of your conditioned response that you've been told how to perceive somebody that's different. And you've been told that if somebody's black, if somebody's gay or something like that, you're supposed to be threatened or be afraid of them. Well, personally, I've spent a lifetime of, like Ed and like Johnny and all of us, but of just going, I'm going to take a second look at that. And that's okay, because that doesn't mean I've lost sight. I'm not one of these bleeding heart liberals that I've lost sight that there are some people. No, I need to have a little more fierce reaction if they're going to act a certain way. Because there are threatening people out there, but I don't need to generalize everybody that's different to me is threatening. In the last few days, I've been downtown and walking around, and there's just a more insurgent, that's probably a bad word, but there's more of homeless people that I haven't noticed before coming around. And it's probably because it's summertime and because they do migrate. And my alert system is up in terms of, call it a spidey sense of what homeless people are probably there's no trouble, they're harmless. But there are certain homeless people, you can tell by the way they move, the way they act. Like this morning, I was walking past one that was right by the courthouse, and he was definitely in a spinning, talking to himself, acting strange, where you could see, especially women walking past, being frightened of him. And I understand he's probably harmless, but his behavior arouses a sense of threat. So this hospitality notion with hostility, I like what Richard is doing, because by coming back to the body, what he's trying to do is kind of challenge the mental dualisms, I think. Challenge how they've been stuck, and see and feel them differently, and so that they're not so caught in our mental metaphoric mindset. So thank you very much.
That was wonderful, Michael. And well, Andrew's back. I'd like to give him a little space to respond to that. I think I'll fill in some gaps since he's been gone, so he understands kind of our direction. But Mike, you started out with the river metaphor of kind of holding the bridge across two divides there, in reference to theism, atheism, or whatever it might be, mind, body. But it reminded me of a recent reading of Siddhartha and the ferryman, who's this relaxed, all-knowing individual. Though he's not all-know, he would never say that. He's not the guru figure, but it ends up being the guru for Siddhartha to bridge the gap. And so he's this wise man in the forest, ferrying people on pilgrimages across one divide to the next. So in order for them to get to some destination, but the ferryman realizes, or Siddhartha realizes, the ferryman is already at that destination. So I thought that was a good metaphor, that you're constantly struggling at the weight of the world, but perhaps you can find a craft to help you sail a little bit smoother. But I think right when Johnny mentioned Whitman, Andrew disappeared into the other world. But he mentioned Simone Weil, I think is how you pronounce the French, and her experience just with starving religion and atheism. And he gave the image of, or that she provided, of the Christian must chop down the tree, take the roots, and carve the cross and bear that cross wherever you go. So that's where he left off. And then Ed helped me pronounce hermeneutics, which I'm still working on. But Ed has direct scholarly experience with someone who studied with Gadamer and Heidegger, and just how that has influenced his life. And he appreciates Kearney's stance, and he noted that Kearney studied with Charles Taylor and the French school in Versailles. So he has quite a bit of background experience, but at the same time, he has quite a bit to say that's outside of the academic realm, and he does do a good job of bridging into the everyday person. So if I can understand it, then you can too. But Ed made note of the term host and the dynamics between hospitality and hostility when encountering the other. And I think I'll take a moment and jump into what Kearney talked about as the five-fold motion when you're in the wager. So you encounter the other, and then there's this wager that goes on. So he's saying there's a five-fold factoring that comes into play of these qualities, perhaps, though he doesn't term them qualities, but there's the imagination, humor, commitment, discernment, and hospitality. So briefly, the imagination essentially opens the door, or receives the other. If you don't have an imagination, then you'll be shut out from the vast other, whatever it may be, or you just won't be creative enough to be in the presence of the other. And he also notes humor. So he states that's, as Bergson reminds us, it is a creative response to enigma, contradiction, and paradox. Then it goes into the commitment and discernment phase of deciding to commit to this call, the call in the street, as he says in the recording, to essentially discern whether, like, should I completely reject this other question, make it earn its keep, so to speak. How is it going to enter my body, my mind, my soul? And that goes on to hospitality as well, which is where Micheal was getting into, of when he was talking about the homeless man or homeless individuals, right? There's always this, there's going to be a fear, but there also has to be the courage to exist within this unknown realm. So there's a lot more we can say with that, but if you feel comfortable, Andrew, with, you can jump on in. If not, we'll open it up to somebody else. Welcome back.
Thanks. Sorry about that. My one of my sons, I don't know, did you guys see him? He kind of popped in for a second and then he went away, and then I just I turned it off because I didn't want to distract the conversation. But yeah, I'm sorry about the lighting here is not the greatest. I don't know if it looks kind of weird. Like I see my image and it's kind of grayish. I'm sorry if that's kind of weird. But yeah, so
weird to get us off balance. Ask John.
We like weird here, so it's okay.
Okay, cool. But yeah, first of all, I absolutely loved what you were saying, John, about your experience. I don't know if it was, you said it was years ago, I think.
Yeah.
With the energy. I just found that so interesting and fascinating. Thank you for sharing that. And I think Doug was talking a little bit about his background, and I could tell you guys about my background a little bit just to give you some insight into my own biography. I grew up in a suburb outside Detroit in Michigan, and I attended a Jewish day school for kindergarten to 8th grade, and I don't remember ever having any religious or spiritual, I mean, maybe I had some inklings of it in the music of prayer, because I always liked the melodies, because we would pray every morning, and I like to harmonize with the prayers. But I mean, my sense of religion then was utterly conventional and like normative or whatever. So I don't remember ever getting anything really out of going to synagogue, which I would do now and then with my family. I mean, and my grandparents went fairly often. So, but it was always kind of like exoteric, like with an X. And it was more of a social affair. Like my main memory of synagogue growing up was like these very elaborate hats that like the women would wear, which is nice, but you know, it doesn't, yeah. So, yeah. And then I think my first experience with spirituality was probably when I was an undergraduate in college, and I have a twin brother who I will forever be grateful to him for this. I mean, among many things. I mean, he's one of my best friends, but he started practicing meditation practice that was then called Sahaj Marg, and I decided I would try it too. And I've never thought of myself as particularly open-minded or whatever, but I kind of went along with the flow and I started it, and it was very eye-opening because it involved this energy called pranahuti that could be transmitted to the person meditating, and I could feel it like immediately my first time doing it, and I was like, oh my God, like this is something I've never experienced before, at least in this life, if you believe in past lives. And it's not coming, like, I don't know where it's coming from. Like it's an energy, but it's not like it's being transmitted, but like, where is it coming from? Is it like in time or space? And to this day, I have a lot of questions about like pranahuti in terms of like how it works and what it is, because it's really mysterious, but it's also very tangible. So that combination is very strange, like the mystery, but then also like how palpable it is. And so that was my first experience. That was in my 20s. I had some mental health issues that led to me stopping meditating. I don't think I was actually, I talked a little about this in a post, but I don't think I was actually ready to have these spiritual experiences. At least that's how I think about it now. Maybe later on I'll have a different perspective on this. But I think I wasn't a mature person then in many ways. So I think it kind of was hard to assimilate and understand what I was experiencing. At any rate, I took a long break from meditating and from spirituality, and from I don't know if you guys are into. I know a lot of people are into Gebser and is not as much into Wilbur. Maybe that's not a fair, but I'm definitely I love Wilbur. I've been influenced by him a lot. But I stopped reading Wilbur. I stopped meditating. I stopped doing all of that. And then I started, got married and we bought a house and started a good job. There's a lot of things that happened, but ultimately where I'm at now is that I have a good job now and I have a family and my life is fairly settled. And so I've started doing, the way it happened was interesting. Like I work as a adult services librarian. So I do programming for the public that we serve on the west side of Cleveland. And someone, I don't know how it happened. I don't know if I proposed it or someone else proposed it, but they were like, yeah, you should do a program on meditation. And not only that, but there's someone who practices meditation called Heartfulness, who's a trainer of this meditation practice. And they go to libraries and do programs. And I'd never heard of Heartfulness. So I said, oh, okay, I'll look into it. And then one night I had this like eureka moment where I think I was learning about heartfulness, and it was the exact practice that I had done in my 20s with a new name and a new teacher, and it had kind of like taken on a new shape that's more, I think it's more accessible now. So I had this like moment where I was like, oh my God, like I feel like there's a reason why this happened. And around that same time, I had been like reading a lot about Judaism and thinking a lot about reincarnation, and past lives, and because I was thinking about child prodigies actually, and like how there has to be a way to explain child prodigies that's not dependent on like brain chemistry and I felt like it's probably like you reap what you sow. Like I bet these people probably worked for a long time on that art or that skill or whatever. So anyways, yeah, and so then I started meditating again and started practicing A Course in Miracles, which have you guys heard of this book? Okay, so that's another book that I've had kind of a history with too. I didn't mention that, but
I was studying Course in Miracles when I had that experience with that mystical experience with that stranger. I was studying that at the time.
Cool. Okay. Yeah. That's okay. Interesting. Yeah. That book has made an enormous difference in my life. We don't have to talk about it too much, but like one of the things about the book is that like it says, I mean, it's supposed to be whatever you believe. It's I'm open to whatever, but it claims that it's channeled, but it was channeled by a woman named Helen Schuckman, and it's supposed to have been Christ speaking through her, and her being the scribe. So that might be out there or whatever, but the actual practical effects of the book are what astounds me. Whether you believe that it's Christ or not, because it says that it's supposed to like remove the obstacles of love from your life. And like it really, I can say like it seems to have like done that for me in some ways. Like I feel late in the past few months, I just felt much more loving. I mean, not like doe-eyed, is that a word? Like doe-eyed and like wispy, but like I felt much more at peace with myself. And I think the Course in Miracles, I think, has played a big role in that. So yeah, that along with the spirituality has been great. And I do think that, going back to the Richard Kearney book, I think that there is something very, at least according to my own like biographical blueprint, that is very true about like having that period where there's a darkness or something where God just isn't in the picture. And because I was a total atheist for like years. I was obsessed with this guy Richard Rorty. I don't know if you guys ever read him. He's kind of he's like a postmodern thinker. And I thought Rorty was like the truth. And today I have a lot of I see a lot of problems with some of his thought. But it took me going through that darkness to come to what's the word, the anatheism, like that, so I think there's a lot of truth to that, like that map, or however you want to put it. And so I'm sorry I missed the conversation. Ed, I would have loved to have heard what you were saying. I'm sorry I missed that. And Michael, it's nice to hear you speaking also. But I don't know, whoever wants to go ahead.
Andrew, it's all recorded, so when the recording comes out, okay, you can review it.
Okay, cool.
I'd just like to add a couple of little notes. Nobody on this site would ever hold it against you that you like Wilbur, because there are just a lot of people that have engaged him in a lot of ways, and with a lot of intensity, and understand what he's doing. I personally have difficulties following him, simply because I think I had mentioned one of those was I have trouble with matrices and colors and lines and whatnot. It's too complicated for me. And most of us have read Gapeser on at least in this group, or are familiar with him in some way. And the attractiveness of Gapeser for me is not that he may be right, but he has it's a handful of structures. It's something very simple. I can follow. I can keep them all in line and not get them all mixed up and whatnot. And he uses a lot of language that's very helpful in understanding things, at least for me. One of them would be, and Kearney says this in his book as well, God didn't die, even though that's been talked about a lot. Nietzsche said it, Marx said it, Freud is talking about it. Since I was doing some work with Gapeser for our Axial Age get together, I was looking through, and he pointed out that Hegel actually had originally said that he must have died, and Heinrich Heine, a German poet, picked up on that in the last line of his 2-volume history of the German religion, says that all of the offerings were brought to the dying God. And what's died, and Kearney does say this explicitly, is the concept. And this, if we put this in Gapeserian terms, because it's very simple, then it's what he would call mental rational, because that's the only place you find concepts, and that concept goes away. And what Gapeser also pointed out is those things that preceded it, the feeling of the gods, whatever they are, or the graven images that were later forbidden by Judaic law, don't make any graven images. They didn't die in that sense. They went away and they come back. And this is the thing I find so attractive about what Kearney's saying is, yes, they go away and they come back. And how they come back makes all the difference in the world. Because we can, if we go with Freud and Jung, we can repress a lot of things. We can shove it down in the old shadow bag. And we don't have to deal with it at all, but it'll come back. And when it does, it's going to come back in ways that we're not particularly keen on, or that we're going to have some kind of trouble dealing with. And so we may want to at least be aware of the fact that we're shoving things around and putting them in places. And it's probably a good idea to at least note where we're trying to hide stuff, so that we can find it again. And this is the this is one of the things about what he's saying that I find so attractive, because he's firmly in this mental rational, because that's what we have to deal with today. But it's also that phenomenon that we're having the biggest trouble dealing with. That's this whole idea. Are we mutating to integral consciousness? Is there such a thing as integral? Is there some kind of transition going on? Are we going to go somewhere else? Which are all real questions, or we wouldn't be wading through tomes of actual age writing, trying to figure out, okay, something happened then. Everybody recognizes it. Is something happening now? How do we bring these all together? So, these are all very real topics that I'm very happy that is in our collective awareness, and that we're all trying to engage and interact with them, because one of the things that I also got out of the interview, and what I think Kearney's saying, is it's hell to be alone. Oh, Sartre said that, isn't it? I think that's all that Sartre actually said. It's hell to be alone. Well, he knew Levinas, and interestingly enough, Levinas, Paul Ricoeur was probably one of the greatest French hermeneuticists, if you will, was his doctoral supervisor, but Levinas was on his doctoral committee. So he was also one of the people that was dealing with his dissertation when he actually did write it. And these are people that are taking a very different look. It's not analytical philosophy, it's continental philosophy. Which is a very different way of thinking. We found that out when we were reading Sloterdijk. There's a very different way of thinking, even though I have trouble putting Sloterdijk into that pot, if you will, with them, because he seems to be trying to break with that. But that's a different discussion. So,
wasn't hell is other people?
Huh?
Wouldn't Sartre say hell is other people?
Sartre said, yeah, but that's what he said, okay?
I'm experiencing that on this cruise.
There are certain times in life when we get to experience things more intensely than others.
Right.
You've ended up in a place like that. My daughter recently went on a cruise with some of her friends, and I have a son who goes on them, as far as I'm concerned, more regularly than is good for anyone's mental health. But, he and his wife also like to go to musicals. I can't do that, okay? So hell can be a lot of things, but what Sartre's bug is that he realized in the end, it's just me. And hell might be other people, but I don't, it's like kind of Dante. You go through these 9 rings, and when you get to the bottom, is that the worst hell? I'm not sure, you see. I don't know if you can actually make these qualitative distinctions, but we, in this mental rational, just to use that Gatesarian term, we just love to lay that all out and kind of analyze it into whatever, so that I can say, well, at least my hell's not as bad as yours, or whatever that has to be at the end. To me, I'm a simple guy. Hell is hell. So... And today it's like this, and it could be that the day after tomorrow it's like something else, and I can remember back when I had this or that experience 30 years ago, and that was a whole different kind of hell. But they were all hell.
I find it interesting in listening to him and reading that he comes back to a topic that we talked about, imagination, of reimagining. Of engaging the imagination in a new way, because it plays a big part in how we actually, relate to life. We imagine, we use our imagination, and I think in the Anatheism, he's actually kind of after it of, it's like learning to use a tool in a new way. It's part of our being to have this imagination. And when we go through, whatever we go through that kind of challenges how we made these. And he talks about idols, Ed, the clinging to idols, which is using our imagination. And I would think habitual ways. is the way I interpret it. I also found it interesting because of listening to Lost Imagination with Gary Larchman, where he quotes Jung being told by his guru, inner guru, Philemon, that looked like Freud, that Philemon was telling him, the trouble you have is you think the thought is yours alone and you own them, and you need to get real because everything in here is real, animals and plants. So it gave me an interesting, way of understanding what Zen is kind of about, or any intense meditation in a way, which doesn't mean sitting. I don't want to break it down that way, but of spending time with our thought activity and how we over-identify with thoughts in an identifying way and don't look like, no, thought, that's an activity, a part of your being. Thought is an activity that's going on. And the minute you try to own one thought or put a label on it, like, let me be very practical. I have 2 children. And the minute I start thinking that they're mine and I own them, I've just fucked up as a parent as far as I'm concerned. I care about my children, but I was with them yesterday and I love them dearly. But I'm glad I don't own them. I'm glad I don't have that responsibility, especially since they're 33 and 27. I mean, I had more intense responsibility when they were younger, but I'm glad I'm really feeling good about, and that's what I'm just tying this in terms of anatheism, because in his interview, he really, for me, nailed of how we have to break down this mental, rational, monarchical, empire, Father God image that probably served a purpose way back when. Everything serves a purpose according to Gebser, I think, but then we have to outgrow it. And he really nailed of breaking that down. And it really, I mean, like I said, when I'm reading this and listening to this interview this weekend, I'm going, it's Father's Day. And he's talking about giving up the father, or looking at the father as omni. I think I liked him distinguishing when we look at the father as omni, where versus maybe in the aftering, it's felt more like the way I come to look at my father before he died and lived with him is he was a human being doing the best he could. And I'm getting fucking goosebumps right now. So that's my take on it.
Thank you, guys. This is a very fascinating conversation, and it's going in a lot of different directions. And I'm trying to keep it all together here. I just wanted to backtrack a little bit. Reading Bella in The Axial Age. He's a sociologist, so he's coming at this slightly different from the way Gebser and the way Wilbur work. Can you guys hear me okay? Okay. Because I just got a flash that my internet was unstable. But at any rate, so I'm looking at, is there a relationship between Bella and the Axial Age, Wilbur with his developmental schemas, Kripal with his gnostic postmodernism, and Kearney's after God. So that's the big question I'm asking myself as I move through these different kinds of texts. And, we're all studying different texts at the same time, and some of us are studying the same texts. But we're bringing to it, our experience of different disciplines and different life experiences. But I do think that there's something interesting that Bello said in a conversation. Well, he says it in his book. He says it always goes in this direction. Mythic, mytho-poetic, mytho-speculative, mytho-theoretic, theoretic. The theoretical rides piggyback on all those previous developments. You don't go from mythic to theoretical in any society, according to Bello. This seems to resonate somewhat with what Gebser was tracking in his structures, the archaic, the magical, the mythical, and the rational. And Bello also says the theoretic is something that you get at a certain level. But he says if you get on the subway and you listen to the conversations around you, you do not hear people talking about axioms and proofs and propositional logic and evidence-based procedures. What you hear around you are stories, endless stories. Well, she said this and he said that, blah, 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 blah. And he says your theoretical scientist, when he gets off work, he's telling stories too. This is just the inevitable way the vast majority of human beings make sense of anything at all, is through narrative. But he says this theoretical capacity that many of us have in the rational is, he believes, elite. It's an elite, a small elite, who work this way. But he says but the temptation to think that this is better than all the other ways is foolish, because the theoretical emerges out of the interplay of all of those previous structures. And it's ongoing. It isn't as if you get to the theoretical and all of a sudden the narrative just disappears. But we're not trapped, I believe, at the rational with any one kind of narrative. So we can move from the mythic to a personal narrative to something that is in between. And those liminal zones, those visionary episodes, it could be the ecstasy of, going on and dancing with with a crowd of people half naked, one of these raves. It could be with some drug experience. It could be in deep meditation. It could be in retreat. It could be in sensory deprivation. There are many, many ways. It could be in prayer. It could be in lucid dreaming. It could be in trauma. Thank you, Micheal. You could get hit on the head or run over by a car, or someone beats the shit out of you. And it could be a parent, someone who's supposed to take care of you is beating the shit out of you. So you might float up out of your body and watch that behavior, that traumatic episode from the ceiling. Mm-hmm. And then when the trauma and when the violence is over, you can float back into the body. So these dissociative processes, unfortunately, many of us consider them pathological. And I believe that these dissociative processes can be created, are certainly necessary. Most people would not survive trauma if they weren't able to dissociate. So I think these are certain things that we've explored in some of our cafes and some of our study groups. And I think it's all ongoing. How do we put all of these different theories together with metaphors and narratives and stories that are we don't have to reject previous mythologies, but we don't have to get sucked into them either. And God the Father is something I am perfectly happy to retire. I don't think God the Mother works for me either. I'm all for Mama. Nature is not your mother. Get over it. She's much more like the bouncer at the bar who's demanding that you pay your bill. And if you're not able to do that, she's going to kick your ass out. So I believe we're all flexible enough and mature enough. Damn straight,
Johnny. Damn straight.
Yeah. And hopefully we're all mature enough and critical enough of these myths that we've been given to recognize that was necessary then. It isn't necessary now. And I think this requires a lot of flexibility. And I think this is what the axial age, that kind of being able to disentangle from the mythic and to reflect upon the myths that are given, is a hallmark of what was happening in the axial age. And that kind of critical stance also seemed to correspond with a renunciation, a wanting to get out of the urbanizing these big cities with all the slums and all the pollution. I mean, a lot of people opted out of those hierarchical, rigid structures that the cities were producing. They wanted to go to the forest. They wanted to go into retreats. They may have had a shamanic impulse, who knows? But they created monastic traditions, emerged out of these kinds of interplays between the cities and the forests. And this sort of critical turn that a lot of people like Bella's calling the axial age. So I think we are in the middle of all of this. And I also want to add something else that Bella said. He said in the age of Christ, in the actual age, there were about 250 million people on the planet. By 1800, it hit 1 billion. 1927, we had 2 billion. Currently, we have about 7 billion people on the planet, and it's climbing. I've heard we have about 2 billion more we're expecting by the end of this century. Cross your fingers. I think we're in this incredible potential cataclysm, since it's already being reported that the oceans, the coral reefs are starting to die off at alarming rate. So I think these are the kind of things that Bella is bringing our attention to. And to add to that, that incredible explosion in population. Is it any wonder that some persons, the anxiety of this increase in population and the overcrowding of the big cities and a sense of reincarnation, they respond to this overcrowding with these beliefs about reincarnation and the phase spaces that are happening, I believe, as we start to think differently about the physical body, the phenomenal lived body, and these subtle experiences, the subtle body. And I think this is often very much confused in most discourse. I think the physical body is the heart, the lungs, the viscera, the genitals, the hands, the feet. There's that. And then there's atoms, the atomic, and the particle and the wave, and all those experiments, and with the quantum. And then there's the lived body, a person with a voice who's communicating. And there's interpretations that happen between speakers. And then there's the written word, which complexifies the speaking person. But all of that speaking is coming from a lived experience, which is different from the physical body, but there's certainly a relationship. Then you have the subtle realms. And that's a very different kind of body. And I think even though the subtle body and the dream body and various kinds of prana, the pranic sheath, there are many different models of the subtle body. But I think there are persons, and I believe we have lots of reports of persons who have gone beyond form and formlessness. And that's where I believe, but they may have interpreted those experiences in a very classical kind of, a very classical Cartesian grid. And so I think a thinker like, and I'm just going to get ready to sum up, a thinker like Alexander Wendt is saying something similar, I think, to what Bella is talking about, is that as we move out of a classical worldview and start appreciating the paradox of the quantum. He says, look at, back in the axial age, this is Alexander Wendt is saying, there were about 60,000 political organizations. Almost all of them were tribal. Now, we have about 190 nation states. So he's saying, and I believe Bella is saying too, there's a direction. And it's Alexander Wendt who's saying, he imagined while he was taking a shower, that 100 years from now, it won't be nation states that are operating. He believes it'll be something else. And that there may be question mark around that, but it's his belief that nation states will not be, which are anarchic. They can do whatever they want to their own people, and they can do anything they want to other people as well. And I found that very resonant as I saw the 2 million people in Hong Kong who protested against Beijing's attempts to interfere in their judicial process. And I'm also reminded that a week from now, there will be a gay pride march here in Manhattan. There will be millions of people in that march. I marched, the first gay pride march was in 1976, and there were about 2,000 people in that march. And we got pelted with oranges and garbage as we walked down the street. Now I think we're seeing something that shifted. So I think there's something in this body, in our bodies, when they come together and hold an intention, a shared intention, which is extremely powerful. And as you said, Andrew, I think you said there's something about that pranic energy. It's mysterious and palpable. And I believe and that can, I think, get more and more mature. And but I think as definitely large groups of people, we can feel this moving through us. And I believe this is where the politics start to change, because the politicians can't ignore that many people coming together all at once. And so I'm just putting that out there because we have a lot to study, and we've studied a lot. There's a lot more to study. But I think if we can articulate some of this the best way we can, I think we can move forward. Our imaginations, and our imaginations are crucial. And the imaginal, as I think Kearney is focusing on, is not just fantasy. There's something objective about these imaginal capacities. So I'm just throwing that out there. Thank you for this opportunity to rehearse, because as we're all trying to study and absorb and integrate all of these different kinds of experiences and discriminations. And I'm hoping that we can connect some of the dots, and that these discriminations can become, open up spaces and also generate future examinations and experiments and reflections. So thank you.
Don't know where to start after that, but I will throw out a shout of appreciation for what you just did there, John, which was, you started off, I think, by throwing out some names and wanting to connect that for the project you're working on. And although we're not all familiar with Bella or Kripal, or haven't read Kearney yet, or Gebser, or whatever it might be, or Wilbur for that matter, it's nice to hone in on what you're focusing on. But even if you don't understand the name dropping, you just, even though we're images on a screen, you just threw out who you are at this moment, along with all the embodiment of what you are, and place that into us. And so going back to the interpretation, there's only 5 of us on the screen, and we're hardly putting a dent on the text that some of us read, or the audio that we listened to. though this is a stellar conversation. And what does that mean with 7 billion people, 9 billion people above that? And yeah, I don't think Mother Nature really sees us. It is a anthropomorphization of nature. And we can go to Kearney and say, well, Mother Nature sees us as the host or the hostile guest and can easily dispose of us or throw us out, or because Earth is always renewing, nature is always renewing, there is that chance of living within that renewal. There is the space provided, but we each have our own separate perspectives. So yeah, the nation states, even if we say in some sort of utopian Earth placement based on spatial temporetics or something, there would be there's the place for that murderer and his group of people. Here's the place for people that think like me. Here's the place for whoever believes in Judaism and wants to be a Sufi over here, whatever it might be. But that's the mechanical thinking. That's the technological thinking that even the questioning soul mind that I am. And I do love this site, you guys, the work we do here, because you've steered me away from, although I never believed in Sam Harris, I just kind of listened to him because he had some decent ideas and seemed to be going in a good direction. But a few of you here have said, well, hold on a minute, this guy isn't really worth listening to unless you are getting something from him. That's great, but why not steer in this direction? But there was no, you're wrong. There was no, even Sam Harris is wrong. It was just kind of pointing out, well, if you follow the path of where he's going, we'll enter into some strange techno-ethical realm that doesn't exist, and you'll be approaching a dead end. That's only one name that I've kind of erased off the list, along with that general idea that technology will, the more technology we have, I imagine virtual reality, for example, will save the experience of not having a body. We're just 5 talking heads right here, and we can see our upper torsos. But virtual reality, that would be pretty cool, and we would perhaps sense the body a little bit more. But what does that mean for the earth? What does that mean for the slave wage labor that's going on in other countries? So although I don't consume, I have hand-me-down everything from clothes to eBay technology, whatever it might be. I'm still adding to that just by simply existing. So that story I'm steering away from. And yeah, there's so many circles and layers and hold-ons, if you, whatever term you want to use. And we each, I think the voice is very important. And I know I can speak for Michael and I, at least, we've developed a voice on here, from the shy guy that I am or was, that couldn't even articulate a few sentences to, now I'm able to get my point across. Good job, Doug. And same with Michael, who said he had an early speech impediment, and I've noticed quite a bit of change, and because there's a passion, there's a holding on to what you believe. And that's what Kearney's talking about, is this return to belief, even in the face of just the death of any sort of old belief. A lot of us give up or seek out passive nihilism or active forms of it. And that's just not a fun way to go. So yeah, it's another general thank you for everything that's been discussed here. We have about 30 minutes left, I think, so no need to state closing comments now. I just wanted to note the time. I will have to leave at the top of the hour, but you guys can continue on.
Just a quick note for John and the dying of the coral reefs. My daughter told me that she had heard on our way to work and back, she heard on German radio, there's a guy, I don't know if he was an American or an Australian, began with an A, and he's developed a way of harvesting coral, even dying coral, and getting it to out of whatever state he gets this into, rejuvenate at a rate that's like 5 times faster than the normal growth. So there are people who work, there are problems and there's issues and people are working on them. And so you keep kearing these things where, well, maybe there's a little bit of hope. It struck me also, in kind of a similar vein, that Kearney in the interview where we're talking about virtuality. And just this afternoon, right before lunch, there was a report on German TV about artificial intelligence in medicine and whether it's any good and whether the AI can diagnose what's going on. And it was actually it turned out to be a very negative report for the AI because they get more wrong than they get right. And one of the key features in getting it right is being able to touch the patient.
Yes.
Yeah. I want to make sure how Michael would react to this one. Yeah, but it was bedside manner makes all the difference in the world.
Right.
Well, it makes a lot of difference. It does make all the difference in the world. I have an odd family doctor here. He's a former Bundeswehr German military doctor. And he's kind of bummed out that he had to leave the military and is now in the civilian world. so he still has from my time in the military, I can tell you, he still has that way of dealing with the patient that is not like what you would normally expect, what you normally expect when you go to the doctor. I've got this problem with my left hand. See, I can't get my ring finger any higher than this because the tendons are buckling up, and I need to have it operated on. And we were at the doctor, and and he said, "Oh yeah, you need to do that. You have to go to the orthopedics." And my wife said, "Is it a big deal?" And he said, "This is his response. He said, a pocket knife and a couple of promille, which is percent per alcohol, blood alcohol. I can do it today."
Oh my God. Oh.
So this isn't the band. This isn't like your everyday bits, but you get the point. No, it's not a big deal. Okay, it's pretty standard procedure. But he has this way of doing this. It's kind of, he's got this skeleton hanging in his examining room, his main examining room, that has a scarf from Eintracht Frankfurt, which is the football team in Frankfurt, which is the local big first league team. And over that, it's a bandolero of shot up 50 caliber munition from one of his helicopter when he was out there. So he's a little bit different as far as family doctors go. But the point is that interaction, that when he says something in that way, it is very personal. It's very direct. It gets reactions emotionally and otherwise. And that, to me, is an essential part of the whole healing process. I don't want to get online and answer a questionnaire. I don't want to have Siri or any other artificial voice asking me questions, because I know you're not a person. And since you're not a person, you can't care. And you won't care. But, if John asks me something, there's a certain caring. Otherwise, he wouldn't ask. He wouldn't even open his mouth. He'd just ignore me or do whatever else, necessary. But that part of it is as essential as anything else that we may do, and we shouldn't forget that.
Yeah, totally. We shouldn't do that, and it's like Kearney and Carnal Hermeneutics. He has several people talking about this issue, updating, of bringing back online what I would term as a lived experience of our very senses, rather than, I even have trouble with some Buddhist meditations way of working with metaphors, of talking with meditations as if you can't trust your senses, you know, when in reality it's not about, it's about getting to know the senses and trusting your awareness or your attention to the senses, not necessarily denying that they do inform you, especially touch and taste. They do inform you of what's happening phenomenologically with your body and living in the world. But a lot of, that's why I had a hard time with a lot of types of meditation that I felt was trying to tell me not to trust my senses, when part of me was saying, no, fuck you. I need to understand what to do with them, basically. And to me, that's an aesthetic. That comes from having aesthetic, you know, sensuality. There's a book, I don't know if anybody's read, called The Spell of the Sensuous by David Abram. And he's an ecological philosopher. The spell of the sensuous is about how we've been, the dual meaning of spell, of how we've been captivated by written word, but then also how in nature we spell, we track non-verbally, we get a sense, you know, we follow something, you know, and how it could be using our senses to make sense, to spell. But yes, the spell, the using that can be used in our bad ways. I can't say the other word I was thinking, but so he gives a really good understanding of. He wrote another book that I read that I actually like this title, Becoming Animal. We've turned our bodies into, because of the mental rational, from my sense, because of working through my trauma, I had to work through the mental rational of thinking of my body as a machine, as an object. And a lot of my healing came of challenging those metaphors and actually feeling my body's very vitality, prana, whatever you want to call it. There's lots of names, and that's good, but the name wasn't the thing. The name wasn't what was important to me for healing. It was opening. And Kearney talks about this too, a disposition of opening after leaving the old God behind, you're opening too. There's this sense of opening and really being with that, working with that, and feeling free, even in the midst, probably, of a little bit of anxiety. Because sometimes what's the term? We're afraid of open spaces. We're afraid to be too open, you know, and so that's what I've been working with these ideas, and what you guys have been talking about. My response is that how do I say it? I'm gonna be persnickety and comical. We're fucking alive. Let's get with it. We're living, and everything around us is alive. We got to get comfortable with that, I guess. Thank you.
Do you have any thoughts, Andrew, or just anything you'd like to say at this point?
Sorry, I just got, oops, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. I just got a message from my wife about, I think we're near Puerto Rico, and I think we're about to take a walk. But yeah, I really liked what Michael was saying about, I think my family's here. I probably have to get going. I'm so sorry. But it's been a real pleasure talking with everyone, and hopefully we can do this again sometime.
Thanks for showing up, Andrew.
Bye, Andrew. Bye.
Bye, guys. Bye.
Enjoy. Enjoy.
Thank you,
Thank
Andrew.
Bye.
Thank you.
See you next time.
See you next time.
Well, I have to share with you something. There was something that we were talking about. Some of my challenges are the difference. Putting all of this into some sort of philosophical framework is not easy. But I think the idea of pantheism and panentheism is something that I struggle with. And pan means all, theism is God. So pantheism would be all is God. And this is something that a lot of thinkers are very persuaded by. Comes out of Spinoza, actually. I think was one of the first persons in the modern era who brought this forward. But panentheism is actually looking at the transcendent and the immanent, and that relationship is not, it does not fit into all is God, which sort of collapses so that nature and God are somehow flip sides of the same coin. So I think this is a challenge, because when you look at my experiences, very, very subtle experiences, I would say they were para experience. They work with a para brain rather than a physical brain. And I believe these experiences are cultivated intentionally through certain practices, some of which are very old, like Vajrayana. But I think there's a recognition when you're in these lucid states or out of body, which I think is a confusing term. I think it's a confusing term to talk about the body at all when you're having these experiences. But there is a sense of a personal pronoun I, one that can walk down the street and avoid getting hit by a bus. Very important to note that that's very different from these subtle experiences. There is still a sense of a personal pronoun I, but it's operating in a very different kind of environment, and one that is not influenced by gravity. And it is, you definitely can fly. But I think those are differences that need to be negotiated. You need to know which world you're in. But I think that that kind of transparency is something that I try to cultivate, but I also think that it can be missing in a lot of these discourses which reduce the complexity of a person to a physical body or to a phenomenal body. I think there's also these subtle bodies, which may be unique to each person, actually. How do you create a discourse that is translatable? How can we create some translations that are useful if we want to create a shared realities with others? So I think this is the big challenge, and I'm not quite there yet, but I am helped by reading this book by Kripal, Mutants and Mystics. And this is my idea of the integration of the subtle, the phenomenal, and the physical. It's his little drawing. It's from a cartoon, God-Man. Can you see that?
Yeah, yeah.
This comes out of, I think, Marvel Comics. But I love this image. And it actually is a pretty good fit for some of the actual experiences I've had. So I'm just putting that out there because I believe we need to engage these, the visual, the kinesthetic, the auditory digital, these synesthesias that happen in between these different senses. I believe that's where the self emerges. And emerge may not be the right word, because I'm not sure that the physical body causes any of this. I do believe that there are correlations between the physical body, the phenomenal, and the subtle. But I think we get very reductive very quickly when we try to demand that the physical brain is the cause for all of these different exotic states. So I think there's much more of something, a parabrain rather than a physical brain that produces these experiences. And from that experience, you are much vaster and you do have a much wider spectrum, certainly in the affective ranges. But when you come to the physical body, it vanishes very quickly, that access. So I think that's what meditation and trance work and dance and art and the imaginal keeps us more flexible so that we can have access to these more intense ranges of experience. And I do believe that, I think it was the guy who wrote Doors of Perception who said that basically the nervous system, the brain and the nervous system is a valve that's reducing the cosmos so that this 3D kind of experience can happen. But it's not the be-all and the end-all of everything. It's just a very useful way of organizing behavior in a particular environment. But it doesn't reduce you at all to just this. But and that is where, when you're aware of that, then this becomes not a hell realm that you want to escape from, but can be, you know, a garden of delight.
Or a playground.
Yeah, and a relational, you know, aesthetics of relationship could become more and more refined, and the quality of our attention can become more and more refined. This could be a very interesting place to be. So anyway, that's my spiel.
Johnny, I have a question. And listening to you, and you describe what you're doing, which I really resonate a lot. You know, one thing I've learned from listening to you, Ed, and especially you, because of the way you just explained not getting caught in the physical body. One of the things that has helped me is I like this term, having agility, the agility to move. I know that I've had, you've heard me explain some of my experiences, not in the same realm as yours, and I honor that your experience, and I can accept that, you know. I do know that I've moved more, I think, between the actual physical and the phenomenon, and not as much in the subtle like you have. But I have the agility in listening to you and listening to Ed and on this cafe. I think it's effective and mental agility to accept that it's true. Is that fair?
Yes, and I could just backtrack a little bit. You mentioned earlier in our conversation, you said, I'm standing in a river, life, lift, and I'm trying to lift a bridge. Like Hercules, I'm stuck in the middle. And touch and taste, and ground in the body, and come full circle, and include other senses, and dropping images of God the Father. And you mentioned having given attention to that moment when you're swimming in the gap. And I'm very curious about swimming in the gap. Mm-hmm. And is there a relationship, and this is just exploratory, this may be another conversation we could have another time, but is there a relationship between that swimming in the gap and Hercules?
Yes. And the relationship is that Hercules holding up the bridge is one thing, but Hercules learning to swim, that's another thing. Okay? And I feel it's tied to my kinetic sense of how much I know, you know, touch and movement probably are you know, they're crossover. Those senses cross over with me, touch and movement. So, you know, being able to enter the river and feel this, you know, and hold this up and know that if you drop it, you fucking might drown. Working with what you just asked me, thank you for asking me to clarify more that metaphor.
Thank you. And we could go a lot further with this, but I may be asking for you to go too far too soon, because we hadn't really developed this metaphorical landscape that you've begun to share. But I do think that it like you making this gesture of holding that bridge up as that Hercules, and then the Hercules that wants to swim, and how that's different. There's a dilemma there, but you're also embodying that metaphor. You're physicalizing it.
Yeah.
And I just believe that this is suggestive to me of how we can use language to reconnect to our embodiment.
Oh, okay.
And just as as Alexander Went is talking about language, and how our minds that use language are entangled. And I think that's so challenging, because it's so easy to invade somebody else's metaphorical landscape with your own metaphors.
Oh, that is so true.
And then, you know, someone will hear your story and they'll tell you another story, and then you all of a sudden your perceptual space is full of other people's images and sensations and feelings, and because we are entangled. But I think that we can hopefully create practices, and clean language is just one of them, and it's been very useful for me in helping to clear the space, this kind of somatic and semantic space. And I believe that has so I'm working on this. I haven't got it down yet, but I think there's a new theory that I'm working with, drawing upon Went and his looking at quantum theory and language. And I'm also reading this other book on entangled worlds. So this is not, you know, this is really very challenging stuff, but I think it's very interesting that people working in the language arts, and people in physics, and working with sociologists like Robert Bellah, and how we can look at each individual as all these metaphorical landscapes. With just a few simple questions, we can start developing them, and we can develop a deeper relationship with the field from which most of us are emerging as language users. So
yeah, and I just want to jump in here, because I think I'm probably part of Bates, and it just all these ideas kind of coming together and cobbling together. For me, if I was not to reduce it, but to give it a kind of talking point, it's really coming to the place of giving attention to the binariness of our own bodies and the brain, but knowing that there's this capacity to honor that, but go beyond it.
That's right.
And it can be inclusive. That's what I feel I've been working with, is I have to include the binariness of simply put, acting on a decision, or, you know, what do I believe? That's the binary. But there's this place that this cafe satisfies me with, is I don't have to I can just be still with that binary, and then allow it to move, allow it to create a more spacious, you can call it liminal or something, but it's kind of just relaxing that need of staying stuck in the binary. And at least part of the language that I've been intrigued with is maybe a third option rather than just black and white. And this third option actually to me feels like actually working with three-dimensional reality in a better way, so you can go beyond it.
That's right.
It's like sometimes the reason we're stuck in three-dimensional is we haven't really learned how to use it in some way.
That's right. And to bring that back to this, what we've been reading today with Kearney and Anatheism, you're a theist, an atheist, and Anatheism is that third.
Yeah.
The third way.
Yeah, I picked that up
Yeah, so I think you're talking about a third option as also. And I'm glad you brought in Bateson, because I think this is very Batesonian kind of approach that we're talking about.
And Thursday, I've been swimming in presenting my that thing, and so this.
I'm looking forward to that.
This has been helpful, guys. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you, Doug and Ed. Thank everyone for their quality of attention today. It's been extremely helpful for me. And I know we're getting ready to wrap up, so if there are any I've already said all I need to say, but I'm very, when anyone else wants to summarize, I enjoy hearing anything you may have learned today. Thank you.
I don't know about a summary, but at least tailing off of what the two of you have been discussing, and you started off with panentheism versus, well, not really versus, but as an alternative to pantheism, and I understand what they mean, but to actually grasp the full concept of panentheism, that word, just like anatheism, is this third way in a certain sense. But if you use it solely as the term, Kearney does dismiss panentheism as it's been written about as something that isn't fully with it. But I think you held up a book by Catherine Keller, I think that's her name, The Entangled Worlds, but there was one I wanted to check out called The Cloud of the Impossible, which is another book she did, which seems very interesting. It steered off from another book that
I have that too.
She has a good take on panentheism. There's an essay in another book on panentheism by Lorelei Bernanke. Sorry, I can't hold up everything right now, but
I've read that book too. That's great.
Catherine Keller has an essay in there called The Body of Panentheism, and she gives a good description of the various panentheism. I can't remember what she called, maybe naturalistic panentheism, into the various levels, and then talking about the purpose of God in the world and outside the world, which is this returning and coming back. And Paul Tillich is considered a panentheist by some. And when I was doing a presentation on his thought from one of his books a while back, I think it was 2017, but I tried to find a way to summarize in very simplistic terms. There were children that were going to be within the conversation too. So I used the hokey pokey. So you put your whole self in, you take your whole self out, you put your whole self in, and you shake it all about. So essentially the shaking is kind of this question, what Kearney is talking about, of shaking up your thoughts of what you knew before. And that's what it's all about. The whole process of in and out, and then that shaking. That's the third way, or it's not even really a third. It's the constant cycle. That's something that Kearney didn't really get into, but he mentioned near the end, that just one little sentence that, well, this process I'm talking about is actually something that occurs. It is never ending. It's not simply you go from religion to no religion back to religion, although that's the core of the book. But in general, the idea is perhaps with any motion or within any temporal framework, if you think of particles or waves, there's slow waves and there's the fast waves. So yeah, there's various temporalities. So the cycling of this process can go so fast, or it can be this deep reflection that might take decades. But yeah, thanks for this conversation. And I just wanted to throw out there too, since we've been leaving the cafe open and this seems to be working out, that we just simply have a video or a short reading to focus on, since we are all busy. So I wanted to open it up to you and Ed, and I know TJ couldn't make it on a Tuesday, but if you 3 or 2 want to work out some ideas that you've been working on within the cafe, and then that will lead into the presentation. But just an idea to throw out there. You don't have to respond now. But thanks, guys. That's all I have to say now. Got anything, Ed?
You guys all lost me in the last 15 minutes. Absolutely lost me. Why are these words so important? What's about the words that makes the difference? It's got to be something behind, beyond. I don't even know the words to describe it. And the words. I could give 2 shits about pantheism or panentheism, and anybody who's going to spend any amount of time trying to make some kind of fine distinction that I'm supposed to grasp is wasting my time. How do I imagine that? How do I feel that? What is it that we're actually talking about? We had said earlier in our discussion that thoughts are there and we acquire them, that we don't. What our agency is in regard to that is a very open issue. But the moment that we start talking about concept, and they are concepts, in this case, they are just concepts, we're distracting ourselves from what we were talking about before, I feel. We are entangled. We're all involved with each other. And these are the kinds of things, I don't know exactly what it is I'm trying to get at, because I actually feel so very lost from the last 10 minutes.
Can I ask you a question? And then we get close to wrapping up.
Of course you can.
And lost the last 15 minutes.
Yeah.
And you don't give 2 shits.
That's a disconnected association.
And lost. And what happens right before you got lost?
Right before I got lost, you 3 started talking about very specific concepts that I don't understand, or that don't have the meaning for me that they apparently have for you. I don't know why it's so complicated. Right.
And when concepts that don't mean anything to you, what would you like to have happen now?
I would like to hear clearer speech about what's being talked about.
Clearer speech.
Clearer, yeah.
Clear speech.
Clearer, yeah. More clear
speech. And what needs to happen for that to happen?
Fewer concepts.
Okay, I have to express a dilemma here.
Good, and then I'm not the only one with one.
Is fewer concepts another concept?
No.
Okay.
Because I think there are ways to talk about what you're talking about without throwing all these words at it. These jargonish words.
Pantheism and panentheism are terms that you can look up in a dictionary.
Yeah, yes.
So I believe I'm entitled to use the words I want to. No matter how lost you feel.
No argument there, John. That is correct. However, let me say one thing.
I share with you a need for clarity. I aspire to that on my best moments. I want clarity too. But I also recognize there's a lot of ambiguity. There's a lot of ambiguity in the words and in the concepts.
What I said, I understand that.
I cannot guarantee that I can be concept free. Okay, I am not able to do that.
Hello.
I'm not. What I said was not a criticism, in any way, shape, or form. Please don't take it as that. It was not a criticism. It is simply. Somebody asked me what I thought. That's all I'm saying. It's not a criticism. If these words could be looked up in a dictionary, we wouldn't have to talk about them. But we do have to talk about them because looking them up in the dictionary doesn't help. Otherwise, we would all know what is meant. And we don't. Or at least one of us doesn't. That's all. And I'm not saying that the fault lies with any of you at all. If there's any fault in not understanding here, I would say I need to look at me. But I feel at this moment, and this is just an expression of a feeling, I feel overwhelmed by jargon where I don't believe it's necessary. I believe we could talk about the same thing in very plain, simple, everyday words. It would probably be more metaphorical speech. But I do believe we could, and I think at the moment, just at the moment, that I would be more comfortable with that. That's all. So if there's any fault or whatever to be found, we'll look over this way.
Well, Ed, and you know, I just want to jump in here. I really appreciate you coming forward and telling me that you didn't understand or you were confused. I'm not sure this is the time to kind of clean it up.
No, I think this is probably something that we could deal with in a number of instances.
Well, because
a period of time, you know. But
I think, and I feel this issue, and this is coming from me and hearing you and listening to Johnny. This is a very, 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 in my being, a very critical, important value that all of us have. How do we express ourselves in language? How do we hear other people's in language? And how do we talk about when there's an entanglement that is not just entangled, it's a fucking knot. You know? And so I appreciate what you said and expressed. I would like to maybe at some other time really kind of tapped into this issue, because this has come up before about how people use words different than other people. And then some people will say, well, you're using jargon. And that may be the case, don't get me wrong. But I come from the place, because of people correcting my language so much, correcting my speech, that the nugget of gold that I've taken from it is, and it was a hard one nugget, and it still, I still work with it. It's like a pearl. I kind of just try to listen to the vibe, and whatever words I can't understand, that's like listening to, it's like listening to a foreign language and appreciating. I love what they're saying. I just don't totally understand in terms of the verbal, but I'm listening to the vibe of what's going across. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah. That's I think a very nice analogy for the whole thing.
Yeah, and also, I just want to add, when Ed is lost and concepts that he doesn't understand, and he doesn't give two shits, and he wants clarity. And when I am working with concepts that are difficult for me, like pantheism, pantheism, that to me is not bullshit.
Yeah.
It may be jargon to you, but it's real, and I'm working with a vocabulary. that I have been given. And there's theoretical, there's somatic, and there's the semantic. And I don't need to tell you about these differences because you have a background in linguistics. However, I am working with a lot of different issues in a public forum. I am doing the best I can, and I wish to God everything I said was perfectly clear, but it is not. It's full of ambiguity, murkiness, strange metaphors and narratives are coming at me, and I'm using metaphors and narratives as well. And they're coming at you, and we're in a relational field that I believe we both value, and I believe we should protect.
And I agree with you 100%, John. And I don't know what I, excuse me, but I don't know what I said against that. All as I said was, I had a problem. I didn't understand. I know that you're trying hard to do this. I'm not questioning that one bit.
That's
not
right.
for a moment.
And the stranger. There's a stranger. And the wrestling with Jacob. The angel.
That can also be. But I was asked what I felt, not what anyone else felt. What I felt, and I expressed what I felt.
And I'm expressing how I feel.
And I think that's great,
when
John.
You told me that I was speaking jargon that made no sense to you. I have feelings too, and I'm entitled to them. And you know, you're entitled,
John. Right.
And we're in this relational space, and hopefully
we are.
We're going to preserve something and learn something from this exchange.
I hope that we are.
And so that we can.
I'm not taking offense. I'm not taking offense at that.
I'm not either. I'm speaking loud, and I'm interrupting you because you're speaking loud and you're interrupting me. Okay, so we can stop this and go into what happens right before.
John.
I'm not speaking loud, and I was not interrupting you. But if you
thank you,
John.
Whatever.
John,
I'm out of here.
Okay.
Thank you, Ed. Have a great week.
You too.
Hi.
I think Doug, did we lose Doug?
I don't know if he's lost or not. He said he had to. You still there, Doug?
I'm packing up from work so I can proceed with my commute.
Okay.
Well, I thought it was just a very lively exchange that we had today. I enjoyed it, and I hope we can continue where we left off. And I guess we should start thinking about wrapping it up.
Yeah.
Have something to share, either one of you?
I just want to share that I think what just took place between you and Ed is an example of what we need to learn to work with, of being intensely entangled from both sides.
Right.
And I think there's also so I don't mean to, I hope I'm saying this right. I think one of the things that in this kind of intensity that raises, one of the things that comes with it is a very a clear difference of how people work with their affect and emotion.
Right.
You know, I see myself just as a kind of a framing of somewhere between you and Ed, you know, as far as the effect and what comes out, you know, and I see it as what took place as far as what I'm taking from it. This is the kind of stuff, even though it took place online, this is kind of stuff that I'm constantly working with people on the street.
That's right.
So
am I.
Yeah, no, and I know you are. You're in New York. You can't tell me you're not working with it.
I'm doing it every day. Yeah.
Yeah. And this is why I would like you to give back the metaphor how you feel agility could come in play with things like this, because that's what I use that kind of metaphor to help me really regulate those kind of situations, especially when they're with my kids, because I have more conscientiousness of being careful with my kids when it gets like this.
Well, I think intensity, you can work with it in many different ways.
Okay.
And you can match someone else's intensity. And sometimes if you want to reach a threshold and go beyond that,
Yes.
because eventually it's going to change. It's how do you want to modulate that change? So I'm not afraid of intensity.
Yes.
And I know that there are people who are more into expansion. They would just want to expand. And then there's those who want to intensify. And we can expand and we can contract and somewhere in between.
Yes. Okay.
I'm fine with that. And I think it's interesting to model in the moment what's happening.
Okay.
And I think I was attempting to do that, maybe not satisfactorily, but I think that I think these perturbations that are inevitable in human events, in human discourse events, with multiple agendas, multiple levels, multiple metaphors and narratives, there's often going to be moments where I don't know what the hell is going on here. And I wish people would shut up and talk the way I want them to talk. That way I will feel clearer about what's going on. And I would love that to be the case, but it isn't very often the case. So I have to deal with the ambiguities in my own discourse, in my own communications, and I have to deal with the ambiguities of others who are saying really weird stuff that makes no sense to me. But it doesn't really matter if it makes sense to me or not. Sometimes it's their process and they have a right to go through that. So I believe that we have demonstrated on multiple occasions how we can have these intensifications happen without collapsing. I think that we can become more and more coherent while we express our differences. And we can have lots of differences that make differences. This is the Batesonian idea, and I hope we'll engage this, all three of us will be hopefully in that call, where we can look at Bateson, because this is exactly what Bateson was talking about. These binds and these double binds, these paradoxes, these dilemmas are very, very confusing, and people need to find a way of working with them because they're epidemic right now. And there's 7 billion people on this planet moving towards 2 billion. Somebody has to do this work, and it's going to be intense, my friends. I'm sorry, but that's just the way it is.
Okay, and I appreciate your intensity. Fortunately, like I said, I resonate with everything you said. I'm just going to honor, I have a different way of walking with what you said, if that's fair.
Right. And I was hit brutally by a father who went, now talk right. I want you to talk right. Right. So that's in my nervous system, okay? I've been told to talk right by people my entire childhood. And I got beat the shit out of it. I got the shit beat out of me many times. Because I didn't talk the way other people wanted me to talk. And I appreciate Ed feels lost sometimes, so do I. Now we can all get lost in the stars. Someone has to stay grounded, drop down into the pelvis, become aware of the body, the physical body, and the lived body, and start to hopefully resonate with all the information that we're getting from the field right now.
Okay,
I think we can ask questions, and we can then get better responses from the field, and we can become more coherent as a group rather than incoherent. But we always have to recognize we are going to have moments where we decohere sometimes, and that's important to recognize.
I need to ask you a technical question.
Please.
A technical question that involves our individual and shared work with trauma. Okay. Okay. The technical question is, how do individuals work with what we work with in our trauma and not re-traumatize ourselves?
I don't know.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, but you understand my question.
That's extremely worthwhile. And I've been working with that. And this is my process. I work with clean language for that very real, that really works for me. If I can maintain a quality of attention so that I can ask clean questions, that helps.
Okay.
It doesn't though eliminate all of the incoherence that can happen in relational spaces with groups, especially in an online forum like this.
Yes.
So we are observers and we're participants. And we're also living in a world of enormous violence.
Right.
And we want to create these safe enough spaces so that people can go a little bit deeper than they usually would if they were in a, you know, hanging out in a bar or a cafe, or
Right.
talking about, you know, whatever happened today. So we're here to do something different than just a chat fest. And sometimes we succeed brilliantly. And I think today we had some great opportunities to explore some very interesting and weird and interesting territory that we haven't gone to before. So I hope that we can continue to sponsor one another in that.
Well, and I definitely like your concept. I picked that up of sponsoring one another versus mentoring of sponsoring. I like that concept. Not that mentoring isn't including sponsoring, but the big picture of sponsoring holds mentoring in a certain way. If that's
right. And how do we sort by other rather than sort by self? We have to do both. And I sometimes will sort by the other person, and sometimes I won't. I'll sort by myself. And Ed, I think, is very good at sorting by the self. It's about me and my confusion. You're using language I don't understand, and I am lost. And that's good information.
Right.
And then there's also, he's often at times, he's very adept at being able to sponsor another.
Right.
And so we all, I think, work with these different patterns and meta patterns about sorting by myself, or I can sort by you, by the other, and my others, because it's not just about you and me, it's also Doug is on this call, and there have been previous partners that are no longer here, that are still in the space.
Right.
And I think these are the kind of things that we're working with in this particular medium. And I think it's a very big challenge, and something that would be very different if we were all in the same room together.
No, and I agree. One of the things I take from Kearney and reading especially his Carnal Hermeneutics is, and you make a good point. I think we need to rethink body, if for no other reason, that Kearney is making a case, I think, that the body interprets all the way down, all the way up. It's like everything you said, there's bodies within bodies. So we get contracted around the gross body. And what I like him trying to tell is, because of trauma, of how to, a lot of ways we have to go down to go up, if that makes sense, to get out. We have mistreated this organic life form and the way we've objectified it, turned it into a machine, how we treat it. So sometimes I think what he's saying is, by going back in, we're not going to leave behind the subtle body or phenomenal. We're just going to, I think, reground, or I don't know another way to put it, John.
Right. But I think it's important that we're able to touch those areas that hurt.
Yes, I agree. The wound, yes.
So we can touch it, and if we touch it, we go, oh shit, I'm going to get out of here.
Right.
Or can we touch it and, oh, okay, can I stay with that? And that's a real challenge, and something if we were in the same room together, we could actually explore that in a very direct way.
And that's your 100%.
But that's not something we have access to right now. So, but I think there's a different kind of touch than physical touch.
Thank you for saying that. Thank you for expanding the notion of touch, because even Kearney says, he brought this up in Cyber, is that as much as he's trying to get us back in touch with the body's sense of touch and how important it is, and how taste and touch are what mediates our senses, the two main mediating senses that we use in operating in the world, he kind of indicates in that interview that what we're having to do is how to translate touch in this medium, how to work with, this is a new type of touch. I imagine it's like me learning how to work with clay. And I've never worked with clay, but I worked with iron, I worked with steel. Well, there may be applications across those two different arts, but they are different. Clay feels different than working with the heat of of iron and pounding it. You know what I'm saying? So there, this is why I relate to your use of liminal and I say crossing over of applications.
Well, I think the liminal zones, we're going through these intensities.
Yes.
The up of the intensity is an indication that you're moving towards a threshold.
100%. Yes.
Now, if you say, oh, this scares me, I'm going to calm down, I'm going to relax, I'm going to spiritually bypass, you know, so I don't have to deal with this intensity. That's fine, and that may be the wisest thing to do, but you're always going to be staying within the confines of that you know, fear is fear, forever evading another reality.
Yes, right.
So you will always be evading another reality, and you can become really good at that, especially if you have some spiritual practices that work for you. But I'm saying on the other side of that intensity, when it comes to a threshold, there can be something else that could happen. You don't know what that is.
Okay.
But you're willing to take that risk. Okay. And so you're hanging out in a public forum with somebody, and they're confused, and you're confused, and you're both being very intense. Well, where is the manual that can tell me what the best procedure is to follow?
There's no manual.
Right. I'm not going to hit anybody. They're not going to hit me because there's these flat screens that protect us, right?
Yeah. But there is a possibility of certain energy being transmitted through these kind of presentation. But okay, so I'm glad you're staying with intensity, because one of the things that I think we need to give attention to in practices is turn towards the intensity and teach and help learn how to work with it and not get thrown off by it. You know, that's hard work, because it's like somebody getting burned by fire and getting burned so bad that they never turn towards the fire and teach them how to use it. You know, teach themselves how to work with it. So I've had 2 hip surgeries, you know, that, you know, I've traumatized myself through surgery and then had trauma through accidents and stuff like that. One of the things in the last few years that actually Vajrayana has taught me is learn to work with your intensity and don't get hijacked with it, which is a learning curve, Johnny. I totally agree with you. But I do think, one of the things I work with, like with my, any incident, I've given attention to the spark of intensity. I still have an option of what to do with it, John. I'm not saying it closes you out, but the option I take with that intensity versus the old way of letting the intensity tell me to vomit on people or to bypass or to freeze, you know, all those indications, those are not choices. Those are something that I'm just doing, but turning towards intensity is at least creating a liminal or a gap, having more choice. Does that make sense?
Sure.
With the intensity that we're feeling.
Thank you. Thank you.
I mean, that just.
I'm going to speak up now, if you don't mind, because I do need to go, but I want to allow the conversation to continue, and I will continue to listen in if you two continue on. But I just want to say one thing about the medium, which this is unedited. This won't be edited. This will be available for us to review, for others to view, and that's something that's not available in real time, to actually review a intensity that arises, which I think is beneficial. And we also have the relationship. So in the process, we understood each other. We've had conflict before, or intensities. And,
or paradox, or impasse, all of the,
yeah,
they're different.
Right. And we've handled it in various different ways. And I feel that what we have here is growing, that we have something that is receiving all these paradoxes and binds, double, triple binds, and anything else that may come up. And with that said, it's it's very beneficial to work with it. And I'm not saying, well, Ed's response is say, well, I've had enough, I need to go. That's his response, and that's fine. And we need to learn from what's happened here, as we're in the process right now. But I do want this to be open. I personally felt safe. I personally felt I didn't need to speak up because of the two who were doing the main appraisal of the situation, trying to come to terms with whatever. And that, yeah, there is no manual, there's no right way to do this, but when we are at our best, when we have our best practices, as some would say, we have the ability to transcend that, to confront this unknown. So I appreciate what's been done here, and just wanted to throw that out there. And I think my question was left unanswered, so I'll post it in the forum or in an email to you and DJ and Ed about what to do with the next cafe. But the next cafe is open, so it can be about anything we want and wherever we go. So I hope to continue with our recent exploration. So this is a thank you and a goodbye.
Yeah.
Wait. Thank you. I'm going to say goodbye too, because I have to go.
Okay.
What?
I want to say one thing if I can.
Okay.
Because this has helped me understand pathology from a Batesian form.
Great. Yeah.
The pathology. And
I'm glad you're picking up on that, because that's why I wanted to study Bateson in a group, is to get a handle on these binds and double binds and triple binds that are pervasive in all human communication. So, and I think in a way we've dramatized that today and in previous calls.
Right.
And what do we do when we don't know what to do?
Right. And just real briefly, and I know we got to go, but Nora, I don't know if you remember reading, she makes the statement, pathology is a learning to learn. Right. And I thought that was an interesting, I don't know if you want to call it paradox or ambiguity, is that.
Yeah. And I also want to, and I think Bateson would agree that not all binds and double binds are pathological.
Okay.
They are also the source of most of our creativity and our humor and our innovation.
Okay.
So we don't want to eliminate paradox, confusion, conflict, impasse. These can be the leverage.
Yes.
That catapult us into more creativity and realizing more of our potentials.
Right.
So I think it's a challenge, and we never know.
Well, and I think I like your word challenge, because it's very shamanistic from Don Juan. An impeccable warrior is not threatened; they feel challenged. they turn what appears to be a threat into just a challenge.
Right.
They morph what is from an average person, no disrespect, of feeling a threat. They just go, oh, this is a challenge for me to be impeccable.
Right. That's right.
Anyway, thank you, John.
Thank you. Blessings.
Blessing. Take care.
I'll see you at the Bateson thing.
Okay, take care.
Okay, you too.
See you Thursday, guys.
Okay, thanks, Doug. Thank you.
Thanks, Doug. Bye-bye.